Welcome to Reflections. I'm your host Jaswant Lalwani, and my guest today is Dr. George Michell. Dr. George Michell was trained as an architect, but moved over to architectural history, specializing in historical sites all over India. He has spent the last 20 years documenting the abandoned city of Vijayanagar, Hampi, etc. in the Karnataka. More importantly, Dr. George Michell is the founding trustee of Deccan Heritage Foundation. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
George, let's start off by asking you a little bit about your background, your childhood, where you grew up, and what made you interested in India.
I'm from Melbourne, Australia, and where we knew nothing about Asia or India when I grew up. But I managed to go on a student trip to India, and I had my 21st birthday at the post office in what was then called Madras. Touring around India, I decided to look at buildings because I was an architecture student, and I got fascinated. Returned to Melbourne via Cambodia. I finished my architecture degree. I discovered that I was really uninterested in working in an architectural office and thought I should develop my India interests. And with some advice from a professor who said, well, if you really want to do this, there's only one thing you must do. You must leave Australia. And so I ended up at the University of London studying temple architecture. And when I was asked, you have to have a thesis, you have to have a subject. I didn't know what a thesis was. And I said, well, why don't I study the wonderful temples in and around Badami in Karnataka? Nobody in London had ever heard of Badami. We're talking about 1970, a long time ago, more than 50 years ago. But now, of course, they have.
George, you call it the Deccan Heritage Foundation. To an untrained mind like mine, the word Deccan resonates with only two things I know: the Golconda Fort and the Falaknuma Palace. But what you call Deccan actually embraces a lot more of the geography than Deccan. So please explain Deccan to the audience. What do you define as Deccan?
Well, it's essentially a geographical term. It's the central part of the peninsula of India. And a lot of this is high up, so it's often called the Deccan Plateau. On one side, we have the Western Ghats leading down to Goa and to Bombay. And on the other side, we have the Eastern Ghats. So this is a region. And the region is not exactly in the south, and it's not exactly in the north, and it's not east or west. It's sort of in the middle. And for this reason, it seems to have been a little bit overlooked in the consciousness of India's geography. But from an artistic and architectural point of view, it's extremely rich. And I would argue that it perhaps has more diverse sites and historic monuments than any other single region of India.
Now that's interesting. And full disclosure, I did not know this till you told me, till I read about it. But the question that came to my mind when I first started reading about you, that normally outsiders, foreigners, non-Indians, gravitate towards the Rajasthans of this world or whatever. But you went to Karnataka and Deccan, which I think is very admirable. I was very curious, was that the thing that interested you the most, or you had seen all of India and honed in on the Deccan?
It began with deciding on a subject for study. And because I had been to this Badami region and I was asked to select a part of India to study, I chose that because these are among the temples in Badami, in and around Badami, are among the earliest, best preserved stone monuments in India. So I wouldn't say they're better, but from a study point of view, that took me there. And once I got there and spent 2 seasons there, I got entranced. Though I have to tell you, I have worked in other parts of India. I had a big project in Bengal. I also have worked in Gujarat and also in some of the Mughal sites and in Rajasthan. So I'm not a Deccan only person, but having spent 20 years at Hampi, Vijayanagara, which in 1980 people had heard of but never went to, because there was nowhere to stay, I got back into the Deccan region and discovered that this was a zone we should really focus on because so many people have overlooked it.
You're very right. I've been to all the regions you're speaking about, and I agree with you. It's resonant with the history of India. Now, you're the founding trustee of the Deccan Heritage Foundation. I want you to tell us, what does Deccan Heritage Foundation do? When did you found it? And what are you doing about it?
Well, it's to do with a group of people, each of which has some connection with the Deccan. Tony Corner, who is our chairperson of the US side of the foundation, has a long history of visiting Hyderabad because he went to school with a member of the aristocracy of Hyderabad. Helen Phelan, Dr. Helen Phelan, who is Greek and she's based in Athens, did her PhD on the early Islamic architecture of the Deccan. I had worked at Hampi and at Badami, so we all had a sort of personal interest in the area, and we felt the consciousness of this region was very low, and we should do something about it by drawing attention to the monuments through publications and through modestly funded conservation projects, which had some connection with the society of these places.
Thank you, George. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back with Dr. George Michell, the founding trustee of Deccan Heritage Foundation. Welcome back to Reflections. We are in conversation with Dr. George Michell to speak about the Deccan Plateau and documenting the various heritage sites there. George, you spoke about research, publications, books. What exactly are these books? What are these research articles? You also do tour books. Tell us about it.
One of the aims of the foundation is to bring knowledge about the history and the monuments of these sites to a general audience. And so we have pioneered a series of guidebooks. They cost no more than 500 rupees. They're very attractive, they're well illustrated, and they have all the essential information that you need. We have 13 or 14 titles at the moment, and we're just getting together a title on Mysore and Srirangapatna. And these range from sites in Telangana, Andhra, Maharashtra, Karnataka. They have temples, they have Jain sites, they have fortresses, they have Jewish synagogues. A complete range of different things are covered. So that is our main body of work. But in addition, we have decided to bring out a handful of deluxe, heavily illustrated, large books, the sort of books that you do not carry around the site.
The coffee table books, what
yes,
you call.
that you look at before you go on a trip.
Yeah.
You remind yourself where you've been when you come back. And one of the reasons I'm in New York at the moment is to talk about the latest book, which is on temples of the Deccan. But 3 or 4 years ago, I was here to talk about Islamic architecture of the Deccan. So we do these sorts of big publications, and they are issued in the US, in the UK, and also in India.
I have read that you really started with the Chalukyas first, and then moved on to Vijayanagar, the Hoysalas, the Warangal, the Cholas, etc. So is that right?
Well, I began, my dissertation was on early Chalukya temple architecture, that is the Badami region, as I mentioned before. And then I did other things and came back to the Deccan many years later to work on Hampi Vijayanagar, which was a site that all the historians knew about, but as I mentioned before, nobody went to, and the art historians were not interested in. It was too late. You have to understand there is a sort of a prejudice against late periods. So we can study Chola, we can study Gupta, we can study early Chalukya. But Vijayanagar, 15th, 16th century, it's not such high quality anymore. And I argued it's not the quality of the buildings that we're looking at. We're looking at the ruins of an imperial Hindu capital city. We don't have that many of those in India which we can study, in which there's something to see, something to learn about. So I would say, together with John Fritz, my American co-director of this project, who was an archaeologist, we pioneered this sort of 20 years of field work at Hampi Vijayanagar.
If I was going to India as a tourist, or even as an Indian, but I hadn't been to that region, purely from a tourist interest point of view, which are the top 2 or 3 sites you say must see in your area that we're talking about?
Well, sometimes people ask us this and we say, okay, we've got an itinerary which covers some of the great spectacular places. It starts with Hyderabad, Golconda.
Right.
It goes to Bidar, one of the most magnificent Sultanate sites. From there it proceeds to Bijapur, another great site. Then it goes to Hampi Vijayanagara, and then it goes to Badami and the area around Badami, and ends up in Bangalore, maybe with a side trip to Lepakshi with the wonderful ceiling paintings. I think that's a good selection.
Right.
It's not everything, of course, but it's possible in terms of a tourist itinerary.
Now, I'm going to repeat myself again. Which is the most satisfying experience of all this you mentioned? Is there one which stands out, like as a must-see?
Well, I think for most people who go to this part of India, Hampi is now the star site. And I think because it is such a spectacular landscape. And so people always say to us, but we would come here anyhow, even if there was no imperial city, because it's such a beautiful place.
I think that's very important, the landscape, because, I mean, this is what makes some of the sites of the world, like Petra, etc., so spectacular. And I've been to Hampi, so I know what you're talking about. And I think it's a wonderful place. Now, what are among these places you mentioned, are you still working on any of these?
I don't think I would say they're finished with, but I would say that I'm finished with them. I feel that I've put in my time, and now my task is to tie up all the strings of the research, and we're now giving all our documents about Hampi and Vijayanagara, our maps, our drawings, our photographs, our notebooks, to the British Library. So it's a matter of getting everything out, deliver it, so that people in the future can come and consult our materials.
We'll take a short break again, and we'll be right back with Dr. George Michell, the trustee founder of Deccan Heritage Foundation. Welcome back to Reflections. We are in conversation with Dr. George Michell of the Deccan Heritage Foundation. George, the thing that intrigues me is you are a foreigner. I'm using the word in a very nice way, but you were a foreigner in India. How were you received there when you went there to document or save or talk about our heritage? How was it received in India by the local Indians, not by us who live abroad?
Well, some curiosity. You know, Badami in 1970 was a very remote place. Almost nobody spoke any English, and they were rather intrigued by these 3 or 4 characters from UK. I came with some other architects and photographers. What were we doing? Climbing up ladders, photographing endless sculptures and things. I would say everybody was quite welcoming, and I remember meeting a woman on the street. She was carrying earth. She was, a laborer. And she asked this man who spoke a little bit, who is this man? And he said, oh, he's England. She said, yeah, he comes from London. And she said, London? She said, does the bus go there? So there were these curious things. People didn't really know who we were.
Right.
They were interested.
Yeah.
And it was a friendly atmosphere. I had to get a permit to do some of this work from the archaeological authorities, but that proved to be possible. And once we got to Hampi, we had a free hand. We just roamed around this site and had a marvelous time.
One of the thoughts that I have, and I'm curious about it, all that you're doing requires funding, requires the government or whatever powers to be their involvement. It's not as simple as just going there and doing things. My question is, do the Indians in India or the diaspora Indians, which of the two support you the most?
Neither.
Then who supports you?
Right. So my Badami project was funded through academic foundations in the UK, and much of the work we did in Hampi was through the Smithsonian. They had rupees through an exchange fund, and John Fritz, being an American, was able to access these funds, which were not very great, so that we could go back year after year and pay for the camp, the car, the food, and keep all the students who worked with us fed and moved around. Nobody got paid salaries. I have to tell you, in the 50 years I have worked in India, I have never been paid for any of this research.
Well, I didn't know this, and I'm glad you mentioned it. And I hope that over time, both Indians there and the diaspora Indians realize that we have to get involved to save our own heritage. Now, what are the new projects that you are working on?
Well, our foundation is continuously involved in restoration projects. We are not a very large foundation. We are not like the World Monuments Fund. We can only take on limited projects, but we try to select those which are historically interesting and which have some relevance socially. So one of the most interesting projects we had was in Bidar, the northern part of Karnataka, this 15th, 16th century Sultanate site. This was an underwater channel. It's called a kanat. It was a way of bringing water from the hills or from a reservoir underneath the city and then having the water exposed as a sort of well so that people could drink the water. And this channel goes right back to the 15th and 16th centuries. It's an Iranian technology that was introduced into the Deccan by emigres from the Middle East. And this tunnel, this channel, this kanat, got completely blocked up and was no longer functioning. And so we raised monies and we had it opened up, cleaned. The water is running, and not only that, we have put in a training program so that local people will understand what they have and how to maintain it. And for this project and some of the others, we have also been able to raise some monies from some of our Indian colleagues, both in India and outside India. So for these projects, we do have some funding from Indians.
But you're constantly looking for funding, I'm assuming.
Well, of course. And now we're finishing off a project outside Hampi. It's at Anagondi, on the other side of the river to Hampi. And there was a disused palace, which didn't seem, just sort of fell into ruin, with a plaza, like a little Maidan in front. And this is the town square, if you like. So we've restored the palace, and now we are going to restore the plaza so that this can become a place with nice shops and the local community can get involved
like a
in
European
running
style.
it. Yes, like yes. Something we have in Italy or somewhere, yes.
So I'm assuming if I want to get involved, I or anyone for that matter, do we just go to Deccan Heritage Foundation website and take it from there? Is that the right way to do it?
It's certainly the best way. You will learn all about our projects, current, past, and remember it's Deccan Heritage Foundation UK. But there you will learn about two new projects that we're very excited about, that we're hoping to initiate. One is a dilapidated pavilion inside the residency complex at Hyderabad, and this was used by the women of the court there, of the residency, and we hope to restore this so it can be used for entertainments, for education, because it's a women's college, the campus. And the other one is in Telangana. It's a very little-known temple site called Panagal, going back to the 12th and 13th centuries, which has beautiful carvings, but the whole site is sort of dilapidated, not in good condition. And we hope to have this spruced up, all the unsightly additions removed, and the sculptures then being showcased.
This is very heartwarming to know that people like you are dedicating your life to supporting our culture, and I think we are very happy and proud of you. George, thank you for being here today, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Please don't go anywhere. I'll be back with my thought of the day. I have always been drawn to faraway places. I feel that all men have an atavistic desire that propels them to places where they have a sense of primordial belonging, a place they immediately feel like they've known before. It's happened to me at far-flung places like the Humahuaca region of Argentina or a small town like Brașov in Romania. As a coincidence, Brașov is the ancestral home of George Michell, whom I just interviewed. I had not particularly heard or read about these places prior to my visit. Then I read Somerset Maugham's The Moon and Sixpence, based loosely on the French artist Paul Gauguin's life. Gauguin left Paris and painted some of his masterpieces in Tahiti, far removed from his hometown. Maugham brilliantly captures this, and I quote, "I have an idea that some men are born out of their due place. Accident has cast them amid strangers in their birthplace. Perhaps it is the sense of strangeness that sends man far and wide in the search for something permanent. Perhaps some deep-rooted atavism urges the wanderer back to lands which his ancestors left in the dim beginnings of history. Sometimes a man hits upon a place he mysteriously feels that he belongs. Here is the home he sought, and he will settle amid scenes that he has never seen before, as though they were familiar to him from his birth. Here at last he finds rest." I am convinced that everyone at some time or the other has felt this emotion somewhere, someplace, or even in the deep recesses of their subconscious. I have felt this on a few occasions, but strongly enough to revisit the concept of atavism over and over again. Thank you for watching Reflections, and thank you for being on this journey with me. Looking forward to seeing you again soon.